Good afternoon. The faithful few are still here, but I promise you it's going to be worth it. I'm Diane Davis. I'm a professor of urbanism and development here at the GSD, and I'm the moderator of this panel, this final panel called Is Public Space Flat? I first want to thank, just throw the accolades on, but I do want to thank Gerald for convening this amazing array of persons, presentations, and provocations. I've just loved every single panel, and I'm confident that this final panel is worth the wait. We're going to get a lot of energetic and thought-provoking contributions in our next panel. If you looked at the program, you'll see that the point of this panel is to go global in a really concerted way, although obviously it was referenced in the last presentation. In his organization of the conference, and also as articulated in the program, Gerald wants us to consider a series of questions about the specific historical context of place and how this affects the use and design of public spaces. With this particular panel, composed of experts who have created and or analyzed public space in different comparative contexts, we will have the basis for reflecting on questions about the impact of history and culture, as well as whether there are universal forms or even a new convergence in action and conception owing to globalization in the production and consumption of public space around the globe. My own understanding of these issues inspires me to suggest that in addition to the focus on history, culture, and built environmental specificities associated with particular cities and countries around the globe, and we'll be hearing more about that in a few minutes, we also want to pay attention to the political and citizenship context of public space, in a way bringing forward the themes from the prior panel in particular, but focusing it explicitly on the developing world. So this means I think we're going to hear a little more about the ways that states, or I hope we will, maybe it'll come in the Q&A afterwards, but hearing more about the ways that states, citizens, and other forces active in city building can impact, mediate, or constrain through state regulation, for example, or citizen pushback against them, both the design and the utilization of public space around the globe. But finally, I think that what is going to be really important about this panel is that we're adding a new analytical dimension to our discussion so far. And that is, we want to ask these questions about politics and citizenship and involvement and regulation and citizen pushback in the context of focused attention on developmental context. And what I mean by developmental context is the political and economic developmental institutions that are unfolding in many parts of what we sometimes call the global south, but the rest, outside of the west, the rest, and our focus is going to be around the globe. As many of you know, we're going to have examples from Vietnam, and there'll be discussion of China and lots of other places, that most of the countries in the global south are experiencing a massive economic and urban transformation, and some of them are even experiencing a political transformation, moving from authoritarianism to democracy, although others are maintaining a strong, centralized, rather authoritarian state. And so the questions we want to ask about public space need to be situated in the context of those transforming structures of politics and economics. In other words, this is not just a comparative panel. It's not like taking a snapshot across different types of public spaces in different developmental contexts. We want to interrogate really how the developmental context frames the capacities of states and citizens to make spaces public. So we're going to follow the order that's in the program. We'll start with the three speakers are Piper Gobatz, a professor of geography at UMass Amherst. Then we'll go to Paul Katz, Managing Principal, Cohn Peterson Fox Associates in New York, and then Annette Kim, Associate Professor of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT, and then we'll convene collectively. So, Piper, do you want to start?
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Gerald, for inviting me. And I don't know if he's still here, but I also give a special thanks from UMass to Adrian Benepe for yesterday offering us half of Harvard's endowment. We'll take it. stayed up all night thinking of ways to spend it. So I'm coming to you today from, in a way, a very different place than many of the other papers that we've been hearing these last couple of days, because issues that we've been hearing a lot of words like democracy and freedom and individuals and a little bit on rights, not so much, but are rarely in the parlance when we're talking about space in Chinese cities. And so it'll be interesting to see how we think about that perhaps more in the discussion. When Gerald called me and invited me to come here, he told me that the title of the panel was "Is Public Space Flat?" And I was thinking to myself, there were only two things that were a little problematic about that subject. One was what is flat, and the other is what is public, but the rest of it was fine. And so what I'd like to do today is introduce my topic a little bit with the whole what is public and what is flat conversation, and then go on to focus on three aspects of public space in Chinese cities. Squares, which are very formal spaces, streets, which are traditional spaces that are undergoing transformation today, and a little bit of an aside on a hybrid form between squares and streets, and then swords is my representation of informal activities in public spaces. What I'd like to do then is start first of all with talking about, see if I can make this work. Okay, it's not.
You're pressing the right button.
I'm pressing the right button. Yes.
Use
okay.
that at the top.
Oh, I love this. I'm free. Okay. So the first question is Chinese public space flat? In this context, we're talking about flat as being some form of generalization or globalization. And here what I just want to mention is the reason why this concept is somewhat problematic for me, or not problematic, but actually opens up an opportunity, is because one way to look at this is the easy way. That's globalization, right? Is how does Chinese space relate to global space? And we could think about that by looking at images like these. There are three images there that are all from different places, as you can imagine. And what's interesting about them is that they have very different meanings. They look kind of the same. And there's differences if you look at them too long, so I'll switch the slide pretty quick. But if you look at them just on the face of it, the physical form is very, very similar. But the places are totally different, all right? The one on the top left is Huntington Beach, California. The one on the right, Yosemite, Beijing, is an absolutely gated, expensive community with servants' quarters in every house. Okay, this is the top of the top in China. And down below, Riverwalk in Santa Clara, California, is a low-income sort of redevelopment project. All right, but they all kind of look the same. And one thing that happens when people go to China is they see a lot of things that look familiar and they feel good, right? You're a little worried you're going to travel to Beijing, and then you travel around Beijing in a taxi and you see this and that. You say, oh, I get that. That's, I can read that landscape because it looks like something from home. I'm familiar with it, so I know what it means. But actually, maybe you don't, okay? Because you see those houses in Yosemite, and if your experience is Huntington Beach or Riverwalk, you're going to get a wrong impression of what you're looking at. So there's issues of thinking about globalization in terms of the facade or the deeper contextual meaning of the landscape, what it means to the people who live there, what it means, how it came to be. Did it come about democratically, or was it top-down, and so forth. All right. Now, another thing to think about, though, is the ways that the global and the local come together in a place like China. And this is one of my sort of pet themes, and that is that it's one thing to look at globalization and so-called flatness between China and other places in the world. It's a very different thing to look at the same phenomena. How do ideas get spread across China? You have to remember that China is a huge place, and it's got an incredible variation of people, environments, cultures, all within a space about the size of the US. And just so you know, it's significant, right? About 1 out of 10 people on the planet live in cities in China, all right? But the cities are very different. Most of us only have experiences of the eastern cities, Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, and sometimes the smaller cities in between. There's another China out there, and I would argue that the other China is and is not experiencing so-called flatness more with the eastern part of China than with the rest of the world. All right, and I'll get to that. Just one example of the way that things get duplicated in China. This is street furniture in 3 different cities in widely different places in China. It's the same idea over and over again. Nearly every large city in China today, you can find these historical, lifelike statues that people climb on. It's just replicated everywhere. It has to do with the process of development. All right, finally, global designers are very involved in the design of the eastern part of China. Local designers are very involved in copying those designs and transplanting them to Western China, and that's what I'll talk about a little bit today. One caveat, oh wait, before I do that, the whole concept of flatness, globalization, you can see here has to do with making connections to landscapes in other parts of the world as a form of legitimation. We are global and we're important if we look like other places that are global and important. That's very simple. All right, so next question, what is public? Very quickly. Public is a cultural concept in China. It has a lot of political overtones as well. I won't get into them too much, but public culture is practiced on sidewalks. We'll hear more about sidewalks later on. It has a lot to do with history. Historically, in Chinese cities, there was very little public space. Most space was bounded in one way or another, mostly with walls. What was left over became just little pieces of public space, especially in the margins between formal structures, in temple courtyards, and in markets. And markets were one of the key public spaces. Markets can translate into sidewalks, more or less. So we're talking again about sidewalk space, market space. You can see here, this is the common way that cities were depicted historically in China. You see that there's a lot of white space in between the courtyards. The white space is what's interesting when you're thinking about the common everyday life of people, and it hasn't been documented very well, but we can find some images in art and so forth. So we're thinking about the white spaces and what do people do in between those big monumental structures. All right. After 1949, during the Maoist era, Chinese cities, one could argue, were very, very flat, more and more flat all the time, which is to say that the basic form was replicated in a very monotonous pattern over and over again everywhere. These work unit compounds, people lived and worked on the sites of the production. You can find these everywhere. This happens to be in Inner Mongolia. And in the transition from the Maoist era, that's the top left image there, to today, you have a continued replication of that same traditional form, walls and gates. All the time in China, it's walls and gates and bounded space. And it's very interesting to see how do you orchestrate getting public space into that very fixed landscape. Okay, so there's a German scholar named Dieter Hassenpflug who's had a lot of thought about public space in China and whether or not it exists. And one thing that he argues is that because of the way that this historical situation has developed, that you can basically talk about China as being composed of Chinese cities, open space and bounded space, open and closed. And it's a useful thing to think about. Okay, finally, for context, just a reminder that Chinese cities are changing really fast all the time, and change is what people are getting used to. 15 or 20 years ago, when the change first started, I think people felt very disoriented by it. Now, more and more, I talk to young Chinese people, and they expect there to be change all the time. It would seem strange if there wasn't. It's just the way that the city works, and this makes it a little hard to talk about sometimes. All right, now I'd like to talk about squares. And we're all very familiar with squares as being the sort of formal representation of public space in the new socialist China, with Tiananmen being the primary example of that. In a way of thinking about Zuccotti Park, the squares are an example of the formalization of a protest movement. If you think about the Chinese Revolution as having started out as a protest against who? Bankers and financiers and corrupt capitalists. Not unlike the protest at Zuccotti Park. But in the Chinese case, they won. The protesters won. And they became the state. And one of the first things they did when they became the state was they created a space where people could gather and protest and formalized it. So this is showing how Tiananmen was opened up, Tiananmen Square, over a period of time. So we're very familiar with the idea of squares as being a formal public space in China. The idea came from the Soviets. The Soviets started making these big squares in order to stage big rallies, very orchestrated, very formalized kinds of expression. China mimicked that, and because of that, in some ways, many people have started to question whether you can even call these spaces public space, because they've been co-opted by the state and they've become state-orchestrated public space. Now, at this point then, that's the big public space, though, that most people are familiar with China. Now, what I want to do is spend most of the rest of my time here talking about a very, very different place, and introduce you to something that may be less familiar. And this is the city of XINING. XINING is the capital of Qinghai province in western China, formerly part of Tibet. It's on the Tibetan plateau at an altitude of about 7,000 feet. It looks like this up in the mountains. It's being planned. It's annexed a lot of land recently, and it now owns the site where the Dalai Lama was born, and other things like that. It's a place where Tibetans, Mongols, Muslims, and Chinese come together. And when I was looking for a dissertation project in the 1980s, I came across this place mostly because of the way that those different cultural groups intersected on a map, and it became one of the sites that I studied at that time. So I've been going there for a long time. This is what public space looked like in XINING before the revolution. This is 1903, streets and markets, street markets. It was a very active city of street markets, a lot of long-distance trade through there. When I went in the 1980s, it looked more or less like this. This is XINING'S public square up until 2000. XINING was a very poor city, unlike many other cities all over China that built Tiananmen-like public squares. XINING held its rallies at the main crossroads. This is it. This is an example of such a demonstration with the department store in the background there. This is it. About 10 years ago, it was gussied up a bit, and you can see that Kentucky Fried Chicken is there. That was the first global firm to open a restaurant in XINING. Now that walkway around the top has been removed. But something happened in 2000. In 2000, the Chinese government decided that the West was lagging behind, and they started a new program to create massive investment in infrastructure in Western cities. And this provided both an opportunity and a kind of a challenge for those cities to come up with new projects very, very quickly. So in the case of XINING, they decided to redress this problem of not having a big public square by building two of them. And they're very interesting because they say a lot about how people see the space, how they use it, and how it's changing over time. These two squares were both built at about the same time, starting around 2000. The one on the right, XINING Guangchang, is well, I'll show you in a minute. It's a new part of the city that's organized around government. The one on the left is a more commercial space that's called Central Square, or Zhongxin Guangchang. If you look at the map here, I've marked on here the location of the former walls of the city. And then the two new squares, the one that's associated with government is to the far your left, and then Zhongxin, the central one, is in the center. This is the square that is in the government space. It's a big, flat, open expanse of pavement with little bits of green around the edge of it. Now, Holly White would be proud of these people because people have started using the edges of it like a sidewalk, so these guys bring their own stools to sit on. Okay, nobody provides them chairs, but they carry their stools around and they sit there. But nobody goes into the middle of the square, not ever, except for flying kites. Sometimes they cross it for that. All right, and this is what it looks like when it's been kind of gussied up for a ceremony. All right, the other square, Central Square, is in front of the provincial gymnasium, and it's a fun place to play. It's very interesting to see the difference between the two. This is designed with more recreation in mind. There's no big, flat, open expanse. It's a multi-level space. There's actually an underground shopping mall below it as well. And it relates to the city a little bit differently. This is where all this fun stuff happens. People spend a lot of time here. They take their kids there. There are performances nearly every night when it's warm enough. All right, so I'm going to leave you those two places. We're going to get back to XINING in a minute. I know I have to go quickly here. Streets, I'm just going to say that streets were the public space, and what's interesting about streets is that they have, in many cases, become co-opted in recent years to become more formal and more controlled in many ways. And we see the kind of informal act of living out your life in public retreating to sort of back alleys and so on as the streets are taken over. And let's go on here. These are some examples of people using informal public space in various ways, but In this case, for example, that building's about to be demolished, so they'll have to move someplace else soon to sit and ponder the universe. People are hanging out in the back alleys here, but they're no longer out on the main streets so much, and that's because this has happened. Things like Nanjing Road. Now, we saw a good example the other day, in the earlier talk, in Peter's talk about how, I think I said Peter, Jeff, how you can make use of like Nanjing Road early in the morning. That's like mall walkers, if you think about that in the US, right? Early in the morning, people can go out and do ballroom dancing or Tai Chi, but by the time the business is open, those people are gone. That's in a way functioning like a mall does in the US. So it's a different kind of public space than in the past. There's a lot of concern here in trying to connect to the global, and that's one of the reasons for trying to change the way that streets function, get rid of local culture and replace it with something more recognizable. I'm going to flip through some things here because I want to get ahead. This is WANGFUJING, the main shopping street in Beijing. Has undergone a tremendous transformation from being a kind of an old market to a sort of socialist market to becoming a shopping mall. And what's interesting about this is an example of the sort of local flatness, the flatness within China. WANGFUJING became a pedestrian street and a shopping mall and a department store chain. The city of Beijing owns the department store chain, and it's now spread all over China because cities in the West want to have something that is associated with Beijing because it sounds modern. It sounds like it's trendy, and they're moving up in the world. So places like XINING, this is Hohhot in Inner Mongolia, places like XINING have built not their own something equivalent to the Eiffel Tower, but their own WANGFUJING, something borrowed from Beijing. Now, is this something that has to do with the public or the private? Is it private industry? Is it government? It's very confusing. This, as I said, this chain is wholly owned by the Beijing municipal government. So I'm not sure what that makes it. It's another image of it. Okay, now then the third central business district. Here, we have two squares. Adjacent to the central square, there's a new development, new CBD project that is being built and involves the destruction of the most lively street market in XINING and about half of the old city center. And this is where this new CBD development will be. The market street is called XINING'S. I won't tell you its history, but it's very popular. It looks pretty awful these days. It's been rebuilt many different times cheaply. It does need to be rebuilt, but it's interesting to see how that will be done. People don't really care that it looks kind of funky. They use it all the time. It's a very, very vibrant space. There's restaurants on the other side of these shops. People are there 24 hours a day. This is the site that's going to be rebuilt. Oops, sorry. Okay, and I'm going to go on. Okay, I'm going to play you, because I see I have 2 minutes and 49 seconds left, 30 seconds of a video, okay? Because I want to show you how this was sold, how these people decided to tear down their traditional city and replace it with something else. Talking about flatness and globalization. I don't really understand, I didn't put the music to this video, but it always sounds very dark. And what's interesting about it is about 30 seconds in, it arrives at the traditional market and the music becomes light and happy. Very interesting iconography there. And you'll see lots of product placement and foreign things in this image. This is XINING'S effort to build something. But you have to understand that this is on the Tibetan grasslands. The main products are, traditional medicines and truck parts and prisons. And it's hard to see just where this thing is going, but this is what they've decided to replace the traditional city with in an effort to move ahead. Now we're going to stop right after this. You'll see the market. There it is, newly rebuilt, reborn within the middle of that complex. Okay, so this is the plan of that project, and this, to me, is the epitome of what is strange and hard to sort out with this idea of flatness and public space. in Chinese cities outside of the East today. This is very global. It's meant to be global. It's a little funky. But it has no connection to the local culture or city. Okay, was their effort, though, to connect it to the global. As you'll see, this is outside the offices for the project. This project is well underway. And I'm going to just flip through here. And the last thing is people using public spaces for different informal use. And my argument here would be that people can no longer use the streets, by and large. Streets are now, they're controlled from traffic or they're pedestrianized. And more, these activities are moving into public parks like this. There's some people ballroom dancing in a public park. And also, though, increasingly, I told you the city's changing all the time, using the informal spaces of change for public activities, kids playing, informal markets, and so forth. Okay, I'll finish there, and we can talk more during the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, this is the forward. Sorry, Gerald. Okay, yeah, good. So, I want to talk a little bit about the word used before, the paradox inherent in our profession between the context of the local and what we do, which is global. And in addition to that, first of all, what is the importance of what we do? And we do live in a flattened global world, and as architects, we work in many cities around the world. And the importance of that is through the exchange of ideas, is to transfer information and knowledge, a little bit to avoid the kind of catastrophic events that Piper was describing previously. In public space, you require cities and buildings. And as you know, and this is statistics that you know, that it took 150 years for Europe to urbanize. The US did it in 100 years. And in China, it's all happened in 50 years, which is a remarkable speed, because our company, which I'll show you some of our projects, has only been in existence for 40 years. My professional career thus far is about 30 years. So I've literally watched all this unfold in front of me, and I'd like to sort of project to you, the future architects, a little bit of the thinking and things that you have to deal with. There is some, and I'd like to make the talk optimistic. The image on the right there is from a talk I heard from the Asian Development Bank last week, and I won't go into great detail, but what it points to is that the increasing urbanization in the Asian cities, rather than what we think and assume to be leading towards a catastrophic climate changes, is actually leading towards an improvement of quality of life plus environmental benefits. And the curve above is pollution caused by urbanization 20 years ago, and the curve below is what's happened in the last 10 years. So this is a very interesting phenomenon that we should consider before getting too depressed. So just a little bit about our firm that's been around 40 years, founded by Gene Cohen, who teaches here sometimes, Bill Patterson, and Shelley Fox. And it was done on 3 principles that were important. First of all, the design of cities and buildings is first and foremost a collaborative act. And we've talked a lot about that today. Second, the commercial building is an essential part of building cities. And how buildings come together, how large buildings form and relate to each other is an important part of architecture. But most important of all, each building is a result of the context and culture where it comes from. And I want to talk to you a little bit about that and the specifics of the geography and culture of the place, and how having similar values, which I believe have converged in urban planning over the last 20 years, can lead to very different and divergent results. And later on, I'll show you 2 projects, one in London and one in Hong Kong, on a similar size plot, a little bit over an acre on 50,000 square feet. The convergent ideas that I see, whether in Christchurch, which suffered an earthquake, or Rotterdam, and there was a very interesting talk earlier about all about really the geography of the place. That talk was talking could only happen or could only be in a city that is below sea level. But the values represented in that, I believe, are the same values that the public participation process that you see on the upper left-hand corner emerged out of the Christchurch experience. And in New York City today, we're involved in a project with many others called the Hudson Yards, which is a vastly complicated project. But if you simplify it to what we're trying to achieve and what the city's trying to achieve, is not dissimilar to what the city planners of Rotterdam or Christchurch are trying to do, including public participation, private-public companies working together, breaking it down into walkability, rediscovering and reusing our waterfront, as in many cities were lost over the last century, pushing out the automobile, which hopefully in the next 100 years will be obsolete, and making our cities walkable, and sustainable. And including heritage, and including the High Line here blending through a new building. So this is a result of a lengthy process and negotiation between a city, a nonprofit organization, and a private organization. We talked a little bit about public space and the nuances between public and private. And in this sketch, I just wanted to show, just in New York and London, two good examples of democratic societies. What is the notion of private space and what does that mean? So in New York City, our clients own the land outright. They build buildings as of right, as it's called. You probably understand that notion. And they transfer air rights. In London, most of the land is owned by a few companies or families, and there's a leasehold. So you can live all your life in a house that you think you own, but you don't really own the land underneath it. And when you want to redevelop that, you will need to consider things like right to light, but that's of your neighbor. So you need to get his consent when you want to build a building to block out his view, and you might have to pay him. You also have to negotiate with the public bodies for the views and what's called the public realm, and that is the view across the skyline. So the skyline of London deals with what's known as the public realm and represents their culture and their values and their understanding of private, where the skyline of New York City represents our understanding of privacy, and that everybody, including Gary Burnett, can build a 90-story building to be taller than any other building, and one can buy the apartment, some foreign person can buy the apartment on top of that building. And that is an embodiment of our private rights that I guess is defended by all the greatest legal minds in this country. Does that lead to better public space than other cities in the world that might not be as democratic? I don't have the answers to this, by the way. So the two examples I want to show you, a project we're doing in Covent Garden in London, where Covent Garden is between the City of London, which is independent, and the City of Westminster. These are the two main cities that form together to be London as you know it. And Covent Garden was started in the late 1600s by the Duke of Bedford, and it actually was the first public space in London, which was privately owned. And he built this to sell vegetables that he grew in his estate outside of London to Londoners. Today, most of the buildings are owned by a private company or public company called Capco. And they commissioned us partly because our office is located there, is to study ways to improve the value for them of the Covent Garden area. And I want to share with you a little bit the processes that an architect working in London goes through to improve both public space, because he has to because it's a process of negotiation with the public authorities and the neighborhood and with the developer. So you, as an architect, have negotiated with a client, which nobody's mentioned the client since I've been here, but they are important. And because as architects, you'll find out that it's hard to practice without clients. So you can see that we started studying the paths and trying to encourage more pathways through Covent Garden to increase public space. And then I'll tell you a little bit about it, but we then centered, this is where Covent Garden is near the Thames, and the shoreline used to be here along the Strand. And we picked these two blocks that together are about 60,000 square feet to redevelop. Now, on the site, near the site, and you can see here is the little Apple sign, because Apple is a global brand, and how they place their stores now is very different from a Kentucky Fried Chicken and McDonald's. They're far more subtler. But if you want to develop a public space anywhere in the world, the easiest thing you can do is get Apple to come to your store to create a successful public space. So no matter all the other theory you have, if you can get Apple in there, you're going to make a successful public space. And then in this market, which was the original market of Covent Garden, there's something called the Apple Market, which I think is amusing. You guys don't. Now, in these paths, when you study the paths and you need to develop the paths, you need a public space consultant. And these charts were created by a consultant who then helps us negotiate both with the City of Westminster and the local inhabitants on the right size of the paths. And you can see how narrow some of these paths are. And negotiating through that, the important thing is to maintain the character of the historic feeling of the space. And they determined that the paths needed to be 3 meters wide. Now, 3 meters wide is a little bit more than this. And it's very hard to then develop commercial space in that. But if the developer wants to build and redevelop and add more paths, he has to stay within the character of as you wind your way through it and maintain the sort of spatial choreography that is true to that area. And not just to general central London, but to the northern side of Covent Garden. So when you talk about global and local, we tend to think about New York as opposed to Shanghai. But global and local can be in the city, can be in the space of a few meters. And the final design, which has a plot ratio of about 300%, so it's about 160,000 square feet, is a mix of uses of retail and food, as well as, that's the groundscape, and then you can see here the narrow path through a 300-year-old building. So we had to take into consideration the stairs had to be preserved in that 300-year-old building, despite the fact that all the uses had to change. And then through there to restaurants, and then this is that 3-meter path. And all this has to be designed and serviced and be handicap accessible and sustainable. And that's before we get to do any architectural drawings. And then above that, the residential. And so the character of the space becomes very important. And I can't read all this because my eyesight's failing me, but as you get, I used to draw, so my eyesight's there. But you can see some key words here like recessive. The architecture has to be recessive. You can't put too much glass. So these apartments on the roof are going to, be premium prices, but you can't make them all glass and look at this at the skyline of London. You need to keep the solid window ratio consistent with the character of the area, because what's very important here is the sort of cultural identity and memory of the place. And that is changing over time. Now, it's important to remember most of the buildings around the square, except Inigo's Church, have been replaced about 5 times in the last 300 years. So, a little bit like in Japan, where they replace the same building again and again, they do the same thing in England. There are a lot of similarities. And yesterday, by the way, this project's been designed by one of the graduates of the school, Brian Gerard. I don't know if any of you remember him. And I was talking to him on the phone this morning, and today he had to spend an hour discussing the size of the bricks and the color of the bricks on this alley. So very careful thinking. In addition to that, and here's the skyline, is what's very important if you want to change a use, you have to negotiate that both with the city and with the inhabitants. So jobs are very important. The biggest social issue in the UK today is employment, and the second issue is immigration. And those two issues, of course, go in hand, and that comes into the design of the city. So I'll go through this very quickly. Is that the time left or the time I've used? Left. Oh, left, okay, good. So I'll speed through London, and you can see here that the design phase takes almost as long as the construction phase. And you've got here at the top of here the list of all the consultants you need to design this project. So to get to Hong Kong, which, as you know, well, I should remind you, used to be a British colony that is now part of China, which is a very important transition to the future of the design of cities. And you can see the density in Hong Kong, all built over the last 50 years, 3 generations sometimes in 500 square feet, all in the area called Causeway Bay. This slide was shown previously. Very inventive use of how to deal with the geography, the escalator system going up to mid-levels. I think this should be studied by urban designers everywhere. I hope you teach it at this school because it's one of the most interesting transformative things in the world today. And you can see that, that Hong Kong changed its zoning from a tower and a podium to a zigguratted form to allow more light and air and to allow more internal public spaces in this dense community. And this building, High Sand Place, we designed so that you could also have sky gardens to create new ground. And so you can see that the building is a vertical image of what we were doing in Covent Garden, but it's got 3 times the density. But most importantly, what this building does from a sustainability point of view is improves the air quality in Hong Kong through these diagrams which we designed, what you can see here that Arabs did, to improve the air quality in the streets, because the biggest political issue in Hong Kong today is the air that you breathe. And in Hong Kong, they worry, will they breathe? In London, they worry, can they work? But those 2 things go into the making of the cities. And you can see the escalators, new form of urbanism. And what we as architects deal with is usually not the grand, huge plazas that were shown previously or all internal spaces, but the nuanced area, that thin zone between public and private, which is where most public space happens and most of your experience in public space. Again, of course, the Apple Store, so it's a successful development. In the first day, they got 250,000 visitors. In the first 24 hours, that's in a city of 7 million people. So people really care about new buildings and new spaces and new experiences. And you can see here the public spaces and what you see through the street, you see the sky. And finally, this shot showing, okay, you didn't see that shot. But the last thing I want to talk to you about is analysis. Should I go back? Okay. So you can see here the tenement of the 50-year-old tenement with people living at 3 generations in 500 square feet. And then you can see here the new building with the new public spaces right next to each other. And the people in these buildings use the public spaces that we've created in this vertical city, if you will. But one of the things that I want to leave with you is the importance of quantitative analysis of public spaces. The importance that when we compare places, one of my biggest frustrations is we can't really measure. And so what we've started doing is developing tools to compare daylight, walkability experience between comparable cities. And you can see here that the New York City, Grand Central, and then the 2 projects I showed you, the 10-minute walk around those areas. And we can then animate and measure the amount of daylight you'll see and then link it in the future to other important parameters so we can have really diagnostic tools. And I think this is potential for where we're going in the future. On a final note, I've got 2 minutes. I'll say, what does the sequence mean? London, Hong Kong, and then the implied China. When I asked the chief planner of Shanghai, which city is for him the model of future growth in China, the answer was Hong Kong. Because Hong Kong has the rule of laws and the real estate development and the tradition embodied in the British tradition, but giving real examples of what's applicable in in China, where the greatest need is. And to go back to where I started, the importance of working globally is sharing these ideas, sharing these analysis, sharing our education, because in all these projects we're collaborating. Most of the work's done by local architects and contractors. And so this spreading of knowledge and ideas I share with you is, if you go back to Inigo Jones, he was basing that piazza and that church on a model that he found in Italy. So everything we do is global and local at the same time. Thanks.
You have my slides up there, please. Thank you. Well, thank you, Gerald, for putting together this conference. It's actually more interesting than I thought it was going to be. Not that I had low expectations, but really interesting people and provocative ensemble of people. And what's been great is you really worked hard to have us dialogue with each other. And so I thought before one of the disadvantages of going last is so many people have already said a lot of the things I want to say, but I do have some new things to say. But I wanted to start with some overarching comments to an ongoing, I think, meta-dialogue that we've been having. One is how powerful are designers in city building and making public space? And so, I think what I would put out there is the notion of environmental determinism, that these structures have some powerful force on human behavior. I debunk, and I think a lot of people acknowledge that as well, and yet there are still traces of when presenting a design, so then this will do this to people. It's really still hard to break out of that paradigm of thinking that this intention of the designer will produce a specific outcome that we can foresee. And that's not only with designers, and I think critical theorists, urban theorists also have that tendency to imbue these physical structures with a lot of power. That is a simplistic narrative. And so that's one thing that I want to say that will preface what I'm going to present. Second is, well, if we put a more humble position for the designer in this process of urbanism, do they really contribute anything? Are they just facilitators? Do they make meetings happen? But they're not going to be top-down in their approach. And I do think they have a unique value to bring. And one is, because of their discipline, is their visual ontology. They present images, as someone said earlier, of things that we haven't been seeing or don't see because it doesn't exist yet. And so to make possibilities apparent is a powerful force, and there is a role for personal vision, I believe, to add to that dialogue of making space in the city. But the way I see space is it's socially constructed, that it's evolving and continually being reconstructed, and it's public space, and I'm going to talk a lot about sidewalks, is not the cement. That's not the public space. The public space is that what we've constructed as society. And third, I guess the overarching question that keeps coming up is, what is public space? What is public? How does space matter? And then what is public space? And a lot of it has been in the context of the US, often New York, but in the US, in a democratic society. And so I think what's another value of this session is we're often talking about undemocratic context and what would public space mean there. So with that, I'm going to advance to the next slide, do it a different way. Oh, and Gerald encouraged me to make a shameless plug for my next book, which is Sidewalk City. And I think part of what our challenge is to see the city again and to see better, to see a more diverse public, and to create new kinds of possibilities, new conceptions of space. And I think critical cartography is very promising. I focus on sidewalks, and why sidewalks is I think it helps us to think beyond public space as a space for the public sphere to build democracy. In a sidewalk, large congregations will not happen. It's a skinny, narrow space with bodies brushing up against each other, and yet it's highly political. And so what is this public space doing if it's not for free speech? So, we started off with Gerald talking about privately owned public space, and I think in the early literatures that was very provocative because we think, can it still be public if it's privately owned? And then we wondered, is there a problem if there's private commercial activities in publicly owned space? And then that's assuming that there's a clear divide between private and public, and so we should be clear that publicly owned public space is not a problem. And yet that doesn't, it's more complicated than saying it's just public. There's sometimes people are saying that there should be free, open access all the time. That doesn't exist anywhere in the city. There's always kinds of rules, and we saw some lists of rules defining what those are, and they're always negotiated. Even so with private space, that private ownership of your house does not mean you get to do whatever you want. We constrain with our society, with our system. So I think rather than public and private and this fixation on ownership, the bigger issue is property rights. And I just put this together because in the norm of design schools, we make slides for the visually impaired, I think. So property rights is, I think, the more salient issue that would help us understand public space. And I have to clarify, often people in the American context, that notion has been hijacked by private property rights literature and the private property rights, political activists that are conservative in protecting private ownership. And I'm talking more generally about the legal philosophy literature behind property rights. And so I'm talking about that any system of how we delineate that public-private relationship is a social contract. And it's a contract of how we will restrain ourselves, exclude ourselves in relation to claims to a space. I'm going to focus on physical property rights. It doesn't mean exclusive only, that it's all about keeping other people out, but actually you only have any claims because we all are restraining ourselves. It doesn't exist unless we agree to it. And the terms of that are very key, that not only is ownership imbued with all these entitlements and benefits, but responsibilities and liabilities. So the terms under which you get to do what, when, are negotiated by the larger property rights system. And I'm not talking just formal legal codes, which gets to the police enforcement issue, that the right, a right is in relationship to the state, that even if you have a local regime and you think you have that right, if the state can then come in and say, no, you actually do not have that right, that was the definition when there's conflict of finding the boundaries of what the actual rights were. And all of this has been in service to support economic livelihoods. And the political question is which economic livelihoods, whose economic livelihoods, what kinds of spatial practices are going to be privileged. So we've seen all these slides. There's a big contestation now in spaces we had overlooked, like sidewalks, which where cities around the world are experimenting with because they have to. We have more people than ever contesting the same space with more diverse spatial projects. We can't do cities the same way. We have to think of space in new ways. And so cities are experimenting around the world of rethinking what this space could be used for and who could use it. We've seen a lot of these pictures already, so I'll flip through. With the gourmet food trucks, for example, what hasn't been, has been alluded to a little bit, but I want to make more explicit in my presentation, is the diverse publics. The issues of immigration and class, that urbanization essentially is about migration, that's where this larger population, the bulk of it is coming from. And what are their claims to this public space? So we saw the HSB Plaza in Hong Kong, and way we've been discussing this is private-public. That relationship could be further extended by looking at empirics on the ground. So, we've talked about the density bonuses that this bank building developer got because he provided this public space, which doesn't feel very public. There's that scrim, and there's a guard keeping people out. That's what it looks, and the power of that design and global capital dominating the city, and yet this is what it looks like on the weekend, as we've already seen from a couple of people before. So I think we need to investigate further on the ground this and further problematize the hegemony of global capital with actual spatial practices as hopeful and inventive ways to think about emancipatory paradigms. And so, I think talked with Jeff before, is it really insurgent public space? And, it's highly political, but they're not trying to overthrow the Hong Kong government or trying to change their worker permit status, the Filipino mates. They're saying we need a place to congregate and live out our lives, to socialize. We have one day off in the week. So, and yet, is it just do-it-yourself, fun, happy, everyday urbanism? No, it's very highly political, related to global superstructures. And it gets bloody. So this is a vendor in a Chinese city that's been beaten by the Chengguan Municipal Force to clear off the public space. And these kinds of incidents happen regularly. And there was a large riot in 2011. And you think about the Arab Spring being touched off by a street vendor protest as well. But how to understand that? So within this context is why I study sidewalks in this book, not just because I like sidewalks, but as a way to think about public space broader than squares and plazas and public sphere discourse. And it's a contest between economic livelihoods of people's claims to space and what's legitimate in that society. And that we need new paradigms, because we're in a major conflict and a conundrum of how to live in our cities. So what kind of tools do we have to work with? Well, two main disciplinary lenses in planning is one is transportation engineering that really emphasizes efficient mobility on the sidewalk. We need to have cleared pathways for walking, and these people are kind of bubbles that need to move through the city. I was a jury member of an urban design competition for the master plan of Ho Chi Minh City, and another design tradition, and I think that's still ongoing, is that to view the city still as urban form, although we've been entertaining much more interest in this society space nexus, but you still see a lot of this. Aerial view of the city as a form that privileges the buildings. Where are the 10 million people in this city? Well, here's some shots of people, and there's just a few of them, and there's some park benches that people are sitting on, but that has no relation to how spatial practices happen in Ho Chi Minh City. And part of it is the challenge of the structure of the industry. These poor firms are only given about 2 months to come up with their master plans and just do one quick visit. And what is it that the city is looking for is the global city that they can now rise up and say we're a part of. And it's not just those foreign firms. So this is an entrant from Vietnam. And again, they live in the city, and yet they have the same kind of glassine structure aerial view of the city. And where are all the people? It's a highly sanitized, formal view of the city. So these visualizations, I think, are still very important. One of the literatures in critical cartography say that most of the history of cartography has been in service of the state for regime operations, for imperial ambitions. So this one is very obvious. This is from the 1931 French colonial exhibit with France shining its light around the world. And it says, with 76,900 men, France has assured peace and benefits to its civilization of 60,000 million indigenous peoples. Right? And so there's been this explosion of do-it-yourself urbanism, new kinds of mapping. Everyone's making maps now. And yet, what can we do with them? So that's what I'm doing with my research group, SLAB. You can look there. So going back to Ho Chi Minh City, I'm presenting sidewalk life in Ho Chi Minh City as an exemplar, which I like that we have something to learn from a city in the global south. And as you see here, that one bench there is empty. No one is sitting on it. But there's very active use of the public space. There's sidewalk cafes. You could call this pop-up. They unfold the tables during lunchtime. It's very common practice. That was my lunch. And there's police officers also having lunch who will later clear off the sidewalk. This happens all the time. People men are always playing board games on the sidewalk. Lots of food, lots of vending, lots of social life. And the main mode of transport is these motorcycle taxis. That's how I got around. And so there's no zone in Ho Chi Minh City where this happens. It's everywhere because it's a city of 10 million people and a lot of people trying to make a living. And the sidewalk is a site for supporting 30% of the people's livelihoods. And there's a long tradition, even in the colonial era, that people will reference to legitimize what's happening now. But Ho Chi Minh City is also the site of social conflict, global contestation of sidewalks. And so there's been this increased enforcement to clear off the sidewalks. There's 3 layers of police roaming through, especially in the historic downtown core. And yet there's a popular ambivalence to this clearance. So this coconut water seller that I've been buying water from for years told me, oh, today's inspection day. The police officer told me, just stand right off the edge of the sidewalk. Then I don't have to clear you, right? Which is much more dangerous now. And there's a widespread debate in the newspaper, online, about unease about this policy to clear. And so there's an active discourse. How do we understand what sidewalk space is for? So, for example, this could look very messy. I know Jeff's working on a project about messy urbanism in Asia. So how can we see this space? So one way is is it chaos? Well, there's actually a system here. So this pathway has been left clear for pedestrians to walk through. This portion, vendors are selling fruit. There's some moped parking over here, and the adjacent stores have spilled over their goods onto the sidewalk. So in essence, there's multiple uses happening on this sidewalk. And what's very interesting in reference to the environmental determinist literature is this is happening on a Haussmann-like boulevard. France intentionally was trying to create a mini Paris here. And yet, that broad expanse, inhumane expanse, somehow they've been able to overcome and engage, right? So how does society reconstruct what that space is about, post-colonial empire, after kind of the hardline communist years, and now in the market transition? Gerald, you're going to have to give me a time watch because this clock hasn't moved. But I'll just keep going until you stop me. So, but the property regimes vary by local neighborhoods. So here in this high-priced area, they've privileged motorbikes and pedestrians, no vending. In the Chinatown, it's been completely overcome by merchandise, and pedestrians cannot walk on there. So there's local property regimes. What I started finding is local ward governments, neighborhood governments started painting lines on the sidewalk, delineating space for different users so that part of it is motorbike parking, part of it is pedestrian, and part of it's recreation. And so what I think is key to overcoming this disconnect between our planning paradigms and what's happening in the field is to do spatial ethnography, to understand the spatial systems on the ground, and that they do vary from place to place. And as others have said about a more sensitive design process, the key is iterations, that you keep going back. And what else is key is to talk to people. I think that's the extension beyond White's work, beyond Kevin Lynch's work, is not only observe physically, but why is someone sitting in the shade on that bench? Is it because they don't like the sun? Is it because they're avoiding somebody? Is it because there was a tradition of meeting there before? We don't know why unless we ask them. We don't have a good chance of knowing why unless we ask them. And also, who is not in that space and why are they not there? Right? So I have to hurry, trying to combine both space and society, so it involves field surveying with my research group as well as interviewing, participant observation, talking to people, and also involves new visualizations of the city. So this parcel map was taken from the Ho Chi Minh City Planning Department. You can't see the sidewalks well here. You can see a lot of other things, but it's a logic of defining the edges of things, the edges of concrete, the edges of buildings. But the main space you experience, you can't go into most of those buildings, is the sidewalk. And so you could do a Noli typo shade map where you X everything else out. But the scale, I've colored in here our field research. You can't see it, again, partly because of issues of scale. If you go into that red box, the scale at which sidewalk life is happening is very fine grained. So you could entertain a different kind of logic. Instead of edges of things, what about the centers of things? That every instance of activity is given a transparent dot, and so more layers will illuminate the public space, so that then the logic of public space is constituted by the public use of that space rather than concrete materials. And another thing we did is this research where I knew from living there that there's active use, but from our interviewing and the benefit of spatial ethnography is that we started to realize 3 times a day is not enough to survey. So we went every hour from 5 a.m. to 10 p.m. on this one block. And up the z-axis is time, 5 a.m. to 10 p.m. What's happening on the sidewalk? And what it reveals is a much more fine-grained sidewalk regime that was much more than I even realized. They coordinate to the kind of uses we see here in a photographic image. But the key thing is that within, let's say, a column of space, that it changes hands over the course of the day. People are sharing the space, handing off to each other. And this is a real system because in communist Vietnam, the police are everywhere. They're coming through here every day. This is the negotiated settlement between the community and the police. They are the state enforcement, although not following the letter of the law. So it came to the mixed user, mixed sidewalks. I guess one other thing I just want to add is with this information, we engaged the city planning department and I made a proposal. This is the Boston Freedom Trail that we know, and they're trying to pedestrianize the city, and I said, told them about this, and they were intrigued, and they said, come with a proposal for doing it in Ho Chi Minh City. And they thought, you just paint a line, that's low cost, we love it. They don't know the real story, but in any case, why I engaged in that is to present a different paradigm of vendors being integrated to the living city. Their original plans had tourists elevated on a platform separated from the city, going from place to place that don't connect. And instead, I showed them, I was trying to use a subversive strategy to use international tourists to legitimize the street vendors. I showed them all this research of what international tourists love the best was the sidewalk life. And so I made this proposal, the visualizations, and of how it might function in Ho Chi Minh City. And that tourists like this sidewalk life, and it would celebrate the living city. And what was so powerful for me was the city planner, lifelong resident, had an aha moment. And he said, I never realized we were going through communities. I thought this was a logistics exercise. And that these visualizations of our profession are very helpful in transferring new paradigms. Thank you very much.
Of summary comment. It strikes me that this final panel was a really appropriate conclusion. I guess I got to keep my head facing this way. A really appropriate conclusion to this conference in a way because it blasted open, at least to my perspective, or problematized, if not sidelined, the concept of public space. And what do I mean by that? It strikes me, at least as a conceptual reference point, because listening to this final panel, I'm thinking that it might be helpful to focus our attention on city space first as an analytic entry point, because the issue of what's public and what's private we start seeing when we look comparatively and historically is so open-ended, tied to histories of traditions. And in particular, so then the answer to understanding what's public or not is embedded in an understanding of the power and capacity of states, markets, and citizens to draw the line between public and private. And I think this last panel focuses on the market a little more than we have in some of the other, although it was implicitly in the other panels. And I think that's a really powerful thing for us to think about, the kind of constant tension and struggle, whether it's legal, so legal versus normative customs, or facts and norms, as Habermas might say, but there's a constant struggle to draw that line. And we see that struggle in the developing world, but if I think back to the discussion of the parklets, the San Francisco example, we see there that also there's a constant transition, a moment of drawing new lines between what's public and private, and that can even be invoked by the state, or do it yourself with government, invoked by the state as much by citizens. So I think that for me, that's kind of one of the really important takeaways of this final panel, that we have to understand the public in relationship to the private as a constant struggle all the time to kind of draw that line the way you want it to be drawn, and there are many stakeholders involved in that struggle all the time. And I have a few questions for later, but let's open it out to the audience for some questions of the panelists. Oh, there's a hand back there.
Can I just pick up on the interesting critique you made of environmental determinism, Professor Kim there? Just strikes me, you observe that environmental determinism is hard to break out of, the idea that the intention of designer can have outcomes we can foresee. I just wonder, as a sociologist, is one of the problems that we have in the social sciences this tendency to take that observation and then swing quite dramatically to a kind of social determinism, which fails to recognise that while space is certainly socially constructed, it's constructed in relation to recalcitrant materialities which press back and allow certain affordances rather than others. So I'm just wondering, and the second kind of layer here is that, so I'm thinking of, the way in which much social theory over the last 10 or 20 years has gone, it has been to try and mediate that position between the problems that are generated between environmental determinism on one hand and social determinism on the other. And the second kind of follow-up observation is, I suppose my concern with the slide to social determinism is the idea that the user as entirely efficacious renders the materialities around us entirely plastic. And it's very kind of convergent with a kind of a Hayekian kind of individualized view that the capacity to order in some fashion our material world is beyond political possibility. So there's a kind of danger in social determinism in that it sounds very progressive at one level and it has progressive openings, but then it can slide quite quickly to a kind of neoliberal throwing everything to the market rather than allowing conscious, collective, deliberative intention play a much more significant role in our socio-material worlds.
Thank you for your question. So I think that's what I was trying to address, that and that's what's so interesting is, so then how do we understand the spatial and the social? Lift it up higher? Okay. All right, I'll just hold it. Thank you for your question. So I think that's the question that we're still all working on, is that balance. So I am totally with you that I'm not saying we can we have the full power to do whatever we want. We're not, that we are very much, we're in Vietnam. The state is very strong still. It forms so much of what's been built, and the legacy of colonialism has structured the physical space. That's still a part of what is shaping the practices that I'm observing, that we do have this boulevard, right? And why there's so many people now is the larger global that have drawn people into the city and the relaxing of the population restrictions as Vietnam tries to follow China's economic model. So very much heavily structured is what I'm saying. And yet, that balance of structure and agency. So why do we see, how do we understand the Filipino maids in that plaza, right? And what can we do with that? And I think that's what we're trying to understand here with the do-it-yourself urbanism. And I think there needs to be much greater reflexivity and more, I call it critical cartography 2.0, that we're celebrating that the state is not only the map maker, and yet there's been so little consideration, but you are the map maker and you are also positioned. And what are you, what is your relationship to what is being mapped? So that needs the next development. Yeah, that's my project.
Got a couple hands up here. There's one here and one here.
My question is also Professor Kim. I really appreciate your grounded research to understand what's going on in the public space, and I also appreciate your comment on the criticism towards being deterministic about space, and that's in fact where the design flows come from. But on the other hand, the kind of research you do is very much, to me, is also very much about understanding the dynamics of the space and how space works and how people interact with space. Doesn't it also, contribute to understanding those dynamics and helping the designers, or is your research more, towards understanding the people? I mean, where do you position this kind of research as a contribution to the design process?
Thank you. To clarify that. So I'm trying to work at that intersection, which was supposed to be the promise of planning, the urban design physical tradition, and then bringing in the social sciences in the 70s, 80s. And yet it's not integrated, that synergy hasn't happened yet. And so what does it mean, for example, if we visualize, and that's actually the way I see my agenda going, is developing a visual social science to really understand physical space, not only space as power relations and kind of geographies, but the actual materialness and the corporeality of space in the city needs to be further developed. And then what I'm trying to bring to the design tradition side is how to incorporate the ethnography, the grounded field research of understanding society in space into the design process. And I think there's an interest in it that didn't exist when I was in architecture school in the 1980s postmodern era, which is really exciting. And I've seen it already in this conference. And I think that's the hope, is enlightened designers can be a catalyst. They gain that understanding as well. But in the academy, we haven't been teaching that. And so, for example, I was asked to come to Columbia's architecture school, and now the designers are going and talking to people, but we haven't given them tools. So then what does that mean to your design? What's your power relationship? What's the ethical way to interact with society?
Testing, okay. So we heard a lot about renovating and renewal and gentrification and innovation. And with Piper's presentation, I was reminded of, when we saw all those buildings collapsing, I was reminded of the other side of this, which is that these communities are destroyed and the local practices are destroyed. And it's true that they will regenerate somewhere else. And so I see a lot of disadvantages to the destruction of the historical place, the general dehistoricization of the material space. And people, like we were talking earlier about social movements and how maybe the Occupy movement didn't know about what had happened in the 1970s with the feminist movements. There's a major problem with this material absence and reminder of the past. And so I was wondering if you all in your individual research, if you still believe that there is a major importance and component in maintaining, conserving this, not just the material space, but the material space of the people, not just monumental space. I mean, I know, Annette, you had mentioned it's the social practices, not so much the concrete or the material. And so, I mean, I can't imagine what it must be like in China, where every year the building's torn down and something new comes up. It must be very disorienting.
Well, I can say that I've done some research in a community on the outskirts of Beijing that was an agricultural village with farmers. About, I think there were about 600 people. And then a high-rise development was built in its place. And it was a very interesting sort of social experiment, like everything in China, because they tried, because in China they're very aware that this is a problem, right? They know every time you move people, you break apart the community, and it's just like, Gantz in Boston so many years ago and so forth. But what they tried to do was put all the villagers in one of the towers. And it's a very interesting experiment because they had 8 tower blocks, and one tower was entirely the rural village, and the next one next to it was basically the State Foreign Relations Bureau bought the whole building and put a whole bunch of these people in. And then yet another one was the secret police, more or less, had one of these buildings. So here was a community with one tower of farmers, one tower of diplomats, and one tower of secret police. And it was very interesting to watch. I mean, it was a disaster community-wise, but it was interesting to hear them. Especially, I talked a lot to the villagers about the ways that how they felt the community had changed. It was in the same place, and they were living with the same people, but in different spatial relationship to each other. And needless to say, they were very frustrated with the whole situation. But it's been interesting. One thing that's happened a lot in China is that people have been relocated temporarily, and they're supposed to come back. And this has been another effort to try to save communities. Let's move the people to the outskirts of the city for 6 months, redevelop the neighborhood, and then bring them back. But due to the kind of hot real estate market now, what happens with many times is that the money, it's more valuable to those people to sell the redeveloped space or rent it out than to come back and live in it. So that's been another kind of a failure with that. So it's another issue. Yeah, so in general, it's very, very difficult to preserve community. This whole community and propinquity is very important in some ways, and it's difficult to deal with that. On the other hand, I will say that since everyone I know who lives in China has moved at least twice in the last 30 years, everyone, people do build new communities, and it's interesting to watch that too, because a lot of the places where people live in cities in China have to do with the community being established after 1949, when people were moved in to share housing that wasn't shared before, either because they're in a new work unit or the older housing in the central cities was divided up. There were these big compounds that had belonged to clans, and they were divided up to house many more families than they were designed for. So what they were living in itself was a little strange and artificial. It was like there had already been one disruption. And what happens now is they're sorting a little bit more to communities where they're making decisions about where they want to live, which is actually a little bit empowering for some people. It's nice to think that you can choose if you want to live downtown. Well, you can't really live downtown, but if you want to live in the inner suburbs or the outer suburbs, you're making that kind of choice. So there's balances both ways.
I'm going to ask a question here because we want to also hear from Paul. It kind of builds on that last question. Sorry about this. That I think builds on this answer and several of the presentations, and it's not so far-fetched. When you were talking about, I thought you were talking about the history in the past, but then you started talking about community. But the concept, thinking about history, makes me want to pose the following question to everybody, and which is, how do the ideologies of modernity either used by the builders or citizens themselves, influence the use and regulation of the public space. And I think this is a question that actually brings us back to some of the panels earlier today. One of the great panels this morning was focusing on impermanence and flexibility, but the concepts of modernity are focused on fixity and formality and permanence, as opposed to flexibility, informality, and impermanence. And I feel like the presentation showed that there were like strange combinations of these things. So I want to hear from the panelists a little more about how they understand these ideological reference points about modernity in their own work, but also in the world that they're living in. Are there contradictions? Is there a spatial modernity that's different from a social or an economic modernity? How do these things combine? Please.
I think viewing this as an architect, and you talked about the importance of looking at the city as a whole. And I want to share, listening to your question and some of the talking about China, and I don't think this should only focus on China. My own experience in Shanghai is one of my first trips to Shanghai. I was taken to Pudong, which was then they were just beginning to build the Pearl Tower. And they showed me the 5 plans that were solicited from international architects, and then they collapsed all those into one new plan, which was a series of massive towers, and they asked for my opinion. I think every architect coming through town was asked that opinion. And my reaction would be similar to yours, was how do people walk between the buildings? And the chief planner looked at me, a very nice gentleman, and he looked at me, and it wasn't really a big issue for him. And I try to emphasize, share with him, and then he was saying, well, that's not an issue. We're also going to get rid of all the bicycles. And I said, well, in Europe, we're trying to get the bicycles back. In the United States, we're trying to reintroduce the bicycles. Now, the point is that more recently, we were asked to help them develop a pedestrian network in Pudong. And that's 20 years after that discussion. And I started thinking about that, and I started thinking about the importance of time in building cities. And what's happening in China is that in our lifetime, not yours but mine, they went from an agrarian society to an industrialized society to a service society. They were more successful in Pudong than they imagined they'd be. And I've sort of got to know those people. And so the importance of looking at a city and the issues of a city beyond the ones that we care about today, and with all due respect to the social movements that are happening today, and they're very important. When you look at a city that I'm recently working in, like Istanbul, and when you stand at the side of the Bosphorus and look at all those buildings, you realize, everything that's happening today is sort of irrelevant in the history of Istanbul, and the more you read about it, and, I started reading Orhan Pamuk again. But, Orhan Pamuk is not really Istanbul of today. Our clients are very different than Orhan Pamuk. I thought I was going to work for people like that. But he's been marginalized in his own lifetime from the politics and what's the urgency of Istanbul. And so, really, at the end of the day, as an architect, what you really need to do is focus on building very good buildings. Because very good buildings will build very good cities. And when you stand in Delhi and look at Latian's masterpiece, my God, he couldn't imagine India today. But I haven't met an Indian who wasn't proud of that building.
Yeah, I know. Gerald, what's the time? We have one final question, and I don't know, should we allow the one final question, or do you want this person to be the first question in the open session at the end? Okay, quick question. Yeah. Quick question, and then we also let Annette and Piper respond if they want.
You talked about knowledge transfer, and that's really what your firm has done for 40 years. How do you democratize and share that knowledge transfer, not just in the real estate and planning community, but among all of us?
Well, I think as an attitude to the architects, I think one of the smartest questions I heard, and I quote a gentleman by the name of Toshio Nakamura, who was the editor of A+U when we got to Japan. And Toshio asked me a question that the more I work, the more I realize is important. He says, Paul, are you going to design a KPF building in Japan, or are you going to design a Japanese building, a Japanese building by KPF? And that is one of the smartest questions I've ever got in my life. And really the answer to all of this is really you've got to design a building that fits into the city that you'd happen to design, but it's, you know, not parachuted in. You've got to make every building different, and then you'll cooperate, and it'll be a collaboration. In Japan, it's easy to collaborate because
yes,
everybody's
but
an
take all
architect.
that knowledge that you have in your firm, and it's, you know, a beehive of activity. And how do you share it more broadly in the general public community? We need that information. How you designed Covent Garden, what you thought about, how it's transferable.
Can I say that that's why we have a graduate school of design? We use cases, we do historical work, we invite
But
people like...
There's still a larger community in social society.
Well, I mean, I think a lot of people are probably horrified and opposed to what we do. But what I think I don't think everybody has to agree about architecture, but one of the things that I've really believed that with the state of architecture today and planning, particularly planning, is a lot better than it was 20 years ago. And every city you go to, and the unsung heroes around the world are the city planners and the people that are fighting for collaboration and consultation. And in Hong Kong today, you can't build buildings the way you used to, and the public is really involved in the process. And by the way, that's good for architects, because rather than us coming and just dropping in and doing the building, we are collaborating, and the local architects are, you know, they're actually become your friends over time, and you encourage them to work in other places, and I think that's the beauty of our profession.
I'm sorry, this is such a great conversation, but I think we're going to have to end. I want to give a round of applause to our panel.